this is Solidarity Economics for the Rest of Us. And I'm Lauren, and I am a collective member of SolidarityNYC, which we'll introduce separately. And here is also Cheyenna, if she wants to introduce herself and say hi.
Hello.
Yay! Okay, so our presentation is going to be it's going to be a brief introduction to the Solidarity economy and then a discussion about what Solidarity NYC's work is and some of the programs that we've been doing. So first, a little bit about ourselves. Solidarity NYC is a volunteer collective, and we're a bunch of organizers, artists, and academics, and community members, and our mission is to support and promote and connect New York City's solidarity economy. We've been around more or less for 5 years. I don't know if Shannon wants to correct that or not.
It's now 2000, what is it, 2015? It's 6 years now.
Woo! So we're like a toddler, if you wanted to put an organization in a toddler year. So, right, so our mission is to make New York City's already existing solidarity economy more visible, and we do that through several different programs. We do that through education, media, we have a mapping project, and a lot of our work is around research and cross-sectoral organizing. But we'll get into that as we move on. But for the impatient, Solidarity Economics in 15 seconds, the gist of the Solidarity Economics framework is that you don't have to wait for the revolution or the apocalypse to have this new economy. It's something that's been happening forever and for time immemorial. What's key to making this work successful is to linking grassroots work together and really busting out of the silos of organizing that we seem to put ourselves in. And we do that through cooperation and democracy. And cooperation and democracy are also great ways to just meet our needs. But really what underscores that is that the solidarity economy and several other diverse economies are happening here and now. We're not talking about some like utopic like end thing that may or may not exist. It is existing, and the key is how do we promote and support that work. So typically when we do this presentation, we ask, when someone says the economy, what do they mean? And Cheyenne, I'm going to ask you what people mean when they say the economy and what that brings up.
Sometimes people think of the economy as this monolithic, uncontrollable force that takes over their lives and dictates what they can buy, where they can work, where they can live, and it's indicated by a lot of numbers that people on CNN throw around that don't necessarily make any sense. Often there are graphs involved, and people think that it's this sort of abstract science that, you know, Obama's getting reports on, and you know, or whoever is the president, some future president, for those who might be watching this in the future, and you know, that it's not really something that they're necessarily participating within or have the power to shape, but rather is this this thing outside of themselves that they have to wrangle with and deal with, basically, usually in a negative way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. When I think of how narratives of the economy exist, it's usually something that is both really fixed and incredibly unstable. And I mean that the economy, it's always, so it's one singularity, it's one thing that's either good or bad, but it seems to be like changing with the weather day to day, and we are all just like subjects beneath it. Yeah, so I really wanted to talk more about, it's a disempowering definition, right? It's a like, just like on a basic human level, it feels really bad when people say the economy. I'm supposed to be doing something to help it along and help it be better, as if it were one thing. And so it's sort of out of those frustrations that diverse economy frameworks came about. And ways to sort of illustrate that there are several things happening and not just like one singular stable thing. So to move on, to have a great graphic, the infamous Gibson-Graham graphic. When people say the economy, they're really talking about, or most of the time talking about, wage labor and market capitalism. And all of these other things that are happening are invisible, that also would be considered an economy or several economies, because if economies are just things that we like value and exchange, and a way of talking about that, then systems of like bartering, knowledge, skill sharing, things that are not in the like quote unquote formal market. It's ironic because this visual like obscures the things that I'm trying to read, like capitalism. So yeah, all of these things are subsumed and then devalued, and it gets further complicated because a lot of these practices are very gendered and they're racialized too. So that work is wholly erased when people say the economy. So, what, were you going to add something?
I want to ask you,
Uh-huh.
who's J.K. Gibson Graham?
You're so correct for doing that. Thank you. J.K. Gibson Graham is the pen name of two writers, two academics, Katherine Gibson and Julie Graham, and they were Marxist feminist geographers, and they did a lot of work on, and continue to do a lot of work on the diverse economy framework, and really introduced that into the Marxist literature in the 90s and early 2000s. And so they have a couple of books that are touchstones for many people. That's how I was introduced to the solidarity economy work. One is The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, and A Post-Capitalist Politics. And so they're wicked awesome. And yeah, but this graphic appears in, I believe, A Post-Capitalist Politics, their second book. And yeah, meant to illustrate all the things that capitalism, or like at least the capitalist narrative, obscures. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so solidarity economics. This is a picture of us in Philly. You can see Esteban in the back. Okay, so breaking it apart word by word. Solidarity, taking active responsibility for our interrelationships, binding our fates together in a shared struggle and livelihood. And I always like to highlight solidarity is more of an active term. It's more active than empathy. It's more active than saying like, oh, I can really like feel and emotionally connect with what you're going through, but it's not, there's still a difference that separates me from fully engaging in your struggle. And solidarity is really emphasizing like, nope, it's all of us. We're nothing about us without us, sort of thing. What does solidarity make you feel like, Cheyenna?
Well, I'm thinking about this second part of the definition, this binding our fates together. And in my mind, it is the act of binding that together, but it's also just recognizing that they are already bound together.
Right.
And that there isn't, there's no way out of that. And as much as people might attempt to use whatever privilege they have to opt into some other society or reality, we are all sharing a planet, at least at the moment. And ultimately, the commons is threatened by this attitude, and that's the environmental concept of the commons, but also obviously more broader social commons as well, and our communities I consider to be part of that. So yeah, I like this definition. I don't really have anything more to add to that.
Great. Good. All right. So taking the other half of the phrase, economics, which is like this more dictionary definition, or not, the ways in which we collectively generate livelihoods and meet our needs. And this definition and just this reminder of this definition makes me think a lot about how I explain the solidarity economy to people that are the people that are less familiar that I care about, like I'm thinking about my family, and how often economics and finance dovetail for people to mean the same thing. And teasing that apart and saying like, no, this is actually like what economics is and what an economy is really allows us to see like the breadth of activity that's happening and that we engage in, and to really recognize that most of the things that we do in a day that would qualify as an economy or an economic practice are non-capitalist. And yeah, doing that mental exercise day to day is super helpful in trying to explain what we're talking about when we talk about solidarity economics. I don't know if you want to add anything about economics, Shanna, if we...
No, I will say that I really think that it's wise for groups to think about what these words mean for themselves instead of just turning to the dictionary, because the dictionary or other sources of its sort is often defining reality in a way that isn't necessarily acknowledging those things that we described as invisible earlier. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that happened with these slides is that we actually took time as a collective to develop our own definitions and really think about what they meant and why. And I think that's a good practice. Like, you just shouldn't assume anything, right? Mm-hmm. The thing is, there's a typo here, and I just want to go on record that we notice our typos. We just are at capacity. You could always give us donations so that we have more capacity.
To not have typos.
To not have typos. But otherwise,
don't tell it.
Yeah, don't discount our words just because we make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Moving on.
Own it, okay?
Owning it.
Words are hard. It is. Oh, Jesus. All right.
It happens.
Okay. So, putting those together, solidarity economics, which would be meeting our needs together while taking active responsibility for our interrelationships. Meaning using the values, and these values, I swear we should do a poll about how often they change. Or not how often, but like there'll be like one value that's slightly different between groups that do some SE organizing. But ours that we use are values of pluralism, justice, democracy, cooperation, and sustainability. And you can also then recast it as grassroots economic justice. Bam. Word. And here's our delightful wheel. So you can't see the top part of it, but another way to talk about, or to get more granular about like the activities that we're talking about that quote unquote qualify. So you have, let's say, like in the surplus allocation part of this wheel, you have all these different types of financing. So things that would qualify would be like credit unions. Credit unions are great because they're community run and managed financial services. You have self-financing would qualify, and you have community financing, you have co-op banks, then you have CDCUs, which are different than credit unions because they have an explicit social justice mission. They serve people that are at or below the poverty line in their constituency. And then in exchange and transfer, it's like a wide diversity. You have things like gifts, but you also have sliding scale pricing, community currencies. Sometimes I feel on the wall about community currencies, but today I don't. So, and then in production, self-employment, worker co-ops and collectives, which are, you guys, that's your jam. We have community land trusts, we have collective houses for consumption and use, housing co-ops, ethical purchasing, all of that. But the point is there's a lot of activity that's not just about co-ops and not just about markets. And that's like dancing on a diverse economy sort of line. I don't know. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah. So I just want to talk about what's in the middle. So sometimes we refer to this as the wheel or the egg because it looks kind of like there's a yolk in the middle. So this stuff in the middle, community, energy, health, food and water, shelter, and education, are all things that we consider to be things that we already actively hold in common in some way, shape, or form. And it's a way to try to start to acknowledge practices that economists are, to be honest, like haven't necessarily documented that well in terms of how we actually meet our needs in informal ways. So all the stuff that was on that iceberg about the invisible, some of that stuff shows up in these other categories outside of the yoke, right? But a lot of it doesn't. And there's a lot of work to be done in thinking about how are people actually cooperating for survival, and what does that mean in an economic framework. And so that's just a little bit of a shout out about why that's there for thinking about that. And that's also an area where if you ever want to, do a fun exercise with a collective or a co-op that you're part of, is to think about that even in your own personal lives, because it probably will reveal a lot about the solidarity that's already there in an informal way.
Yeah, usually when we do this 101 with students, there's a small group breakout where we talk about, okay, now what are the practices that we do that we see put up here as some examples, and then how could we sort of riff off of that? And it's always amazing because you start the exercise thinking oh no, no one's familiar with this thing, and then you realize, oh, this is how people survive. So we're actually all experts and incredibly familiar with that. But it is a great exercise to do.
And the last thing to share is that these bold titles, which give you these kind of economic terms, consumption, use, all of that, the one at the top is creation.
Yeah.
So if you're wondering what that was. And I'd like to attribute also with this one, this comes from the work of Ethan Miller, and we've done a lot of work with him and independent of him to refine this for our own use in our organizing. But originally, Ethan is the one who came up with this, and you can find a lot of his work on our website, and I believe he's also still part of the Community Economies Collective and the JED Collective up in Maine, and GEO Journal, which is Grassroots Economic Organizing. So you can find him on the web. He's a fabulous theorist and a friend of SolidarityNYC. Thanks, Ethan.
Woo! Thanks, Ethan. So this is my favorite slide because I always feel like it's my get on a soapbox sassy slide. Sassy slide is a great word. So a note about jargon. Many of the practices that we talk about we're using within the solidarity economy universe has often been recast and described as the commons or sharing economy, an alternative economy, collaborative consumption, or the new economy. And there's a very particular reason why we use solidarity economy, because it has a very particular historical and geographic origin point, the global justice, anti-globalization movement in Latin America that we are in solidarity with. And one of my big things is that we refuse to reify the dominant economy. It's not an alternative, quote-unquote alternative economy that we're talking about because it's all existing in the same plane, on the same realm of existence as everything else. So there is a temptation to say this is a quote-unquote dominant system and this is a subordinate system, and all of these radical alternative, quote-unquote alternative things are somehow subordinate to what's happening in a dominant thing. And while there are parts of our lives that are really defined by dominant structures, it's still important to make these cracks and show these spaces of things that aren't. And by and by, that's sort of chipping away at this disempowering narrative. So it's this really important, myth-busting sort of work that has to happen. It's happening both as a grassroots movement and boots on the ground sort of work, but it's also a work about imagining how we imagining futures and how we imagine possibility. And I don't know, Cheyenna, if you had feelings about
I do have a lot of feelings about the choice, because in the United States, the way that we approach social change is often through the nonprofit lens and the nonprofit industrial complex. And that requires that individual groups claim to have the great idea that's going to save humanity, and they trot that around to their funders, and then they get money based on that idea. And this encourages groups to claim things and be proprietary about things as their own, and to rename stuff that other groups have been doing for a long time. And so, people often in some spaces refer to the work that all the groups, and practices that we described earlier as the new economy, and calling it that means erasing what already exists, and also really refusing to acknowledge the vast history of these practices. And whether you're talking about credit unions that developed in low-income communities because of redlining, or housing cooperatives that labor unions formed, a century ago, or I don't know, name something else. Sliding scale pricing, certainly, that's been around. We've all been cutting each other breaks forever. Sometimes even the capitalists do that. It seems to me that, it's often used in a way that might seem innocuous, but because of the funding space that we're in, it often allows groups to, with more privilege and more access to funding, to lay claim to the work that's much broader and a lot of other people are using. And so which terms you use really does matter. And collaborative consumption is something that's been documented by a lot of people in the tech industry, and there are books about that, and people do TED Talks on it and that kind of thing, and it's coming out of that space. Lauren told you why we didn't really like alternative economy, because, well, reasons, right? Mm-hmm. Sharing economy is another one where, that includes groups like Uber, and TaskRabbit and some of these others that are really just capitalist forms of exploitation that don't share their profits and aren't community owned or managed. So it is really important what you call things. And yes, we are definitely in solidarity with the global justice movement and folks who were using this term in the 1980s in Latin America, but increasingly we want to use that word here. And people sometimes criticize SolidarityNYC, or they have, because they've said, well, you can't use words like solidarity. Everybody will think you're a socialist. They'll think you're red, and you're not going to reach many people with those terms. And there's a real need to reclaim this language and not to try to have something that's uniquely American because we can't participate in something that's global. So the only other one that's here, I'll just note, is the social economy, which is sometimes used in France in particular and in Canada. And those folks, that was a word or language they were using in the 90s that they now will often put social or solidarity economy. So even those groups are trying to do the same thing, where they're trying to remain consistent with the global movement. So that's why.
So in tracing sort of the timeline that we're talking about with the global justice movement and solidarity economy, this is just like a loose one that we use. I know that there are more specific like dates and events and flashpoints, but some of the major ones in thinking about the solidarity economy in the 1980s was really used in the global south as people began to reject the neoliberal policies by the global north, and a reaction of structural adjustment policies that were happening that were really demoralizing and disempowering to people that had been using these communal and cooperative ways of living for generations. It was meant to articulate a sort of reprioritization of our needs and the real consciousness raising of people and planet over profit that was beginning to emerge. There's a lot of work that happens both in the academic and more like movement space around the 1990s, and this is where I mentioned Gibbs and Graham before. I think that they're not that they're the be all end all of like thinkers, but they're players in this space, and they're the people I'm most familiar with. their book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, being like a Marxist feminist intervention, that happened around like 1996, just to give like one moment of like when this was happening in at least the academic space, and how that sort of really opened up a new space for like economic thought in the university system. I'm in school, so I think about it a lot. And then in '99, you have the anti-globalization movements in the USA, and you have Seattle WTO protests. And then we have, and I'm going to be really, okay, well, we're just going to have to pretend we know what happened in 2001. I know, but we have the World Social Forum hosting a lot of presentations on solidarity economy. And then in 2007, you have the formation of the Solidarity Economy Network, which is SEN, which is dandy. I don't know, Cheyenna, if you want to talk a little bit about 2007 and Social Forum and SEN and stuff, because I feel like you were there and I was not.
Well, I was not at the Social Forum, but
Sorry.
I have a little bit of information about it to share. So mostly the Social Forum is an opportunity for all of these global groups to come together. And so you had activists who were using the solidarity economy language in other places show up and educate Americans about that. And there were already some academic theorists in the U.S. who were in conversation with them and part of international networks. One of them is called RIPESS, R-I-P-E-S-S. What that stands for at the moment is I can't quite remember, but I'm not an academic. Maybe you can tell.
Oh.
But anyway, they all came together and they decided to form this U.S.-based solidarity economy network. And that group decided that the first thing they could do was really provide a forum for United States activists to gather. And so that was held in 2009 in Northampton, up at the 5 colleges. And at that point, a number of activists started talking together about not just how to build a network, but what this local organizing should look like. And I did attend that and met a lot of really wonderful, amazing people there. And SolidarityNYC actually grew out of that. A bunch of us from New York met while we were there. We had to go to Pioneer Valley to meet. And that's a little bit of our personal story of how, the organization story of how our work formed. Is that what you meant, Lauren?
That is exactly what I meant. That was the thing that I was remembering, not the other thing.
Cool.
Thank you. If we move to sort of like now like more geographic understandings of solidarity economy things, so Montreal is a great example. Like Cheyenna mentioned, they use social and solidarity economy a lot. A lot of the context is different from like what we're seeing in the U.S. in terms of our organizing, what that looks like. I've done a little bit of SolidarityNYC as a collective has gone to Montreal to do some sort of learning, which we'll talk about a bit later in the presentation. And I myself have done a bit of research on Montreal just because it is so interesting and specific. But yeah, they're pretty awesome, and this is like in just like Quebec and the province is pretty great at being able to pull together interests of labor and interests of the state, no matter what your feelings about the state are, together to sort of support a lot of social and solidarity economy programming and a lot of financial support. A lot of like the really great sort of co-op financing models are found in Quebec, and they're just like amazing ways in which certain projects and certain things get like funded there, which is pretty cool. And the fact that at least in Quebec, which is what I'm familiar with, the organizing happens both sectorally and regionally. So it's this really integrated system, and there have been critiques that it's, you know, overly federated, but the fact that like the space is so vast to organize both regionally and sectorally is something that like in my heart of hearts and dreams of dreams I would love to see and have like seen steps toward a type of organizing model that's like that here. And then just to rattle off a few, in the Global South, you have the MST, which is the Landless Workers Movement. You have the Zapatistas. You have the Recovered Factories Movement. A great anecdote, Marina Citrin, who wrote Horizontalism, and she just wrote They Can't Represent Us. I was at a lecture that she was hosting about her book, and she was talking about the Recovered Factories movement, and she was talking about how there, again, the importance of language and narrative, because I think people use a different term that I can't remember for what this is, or it's not necessarily recovered, but take over or something like that. And she's saying no, we should really think of it as recovered or reclaimed, because thinking about how labor and capital works, you're taking back all of this labor and all of the surplus value that was exploited from you. And that's really important to make that quote unquote economic understanding and a sort of theoretical and embodied understanding of what that means. And so I always like to throw that in, because I thought that was really cool to demonstrate that words mean things, underscore. And then you have examples in Venezuela, Italy, Brazil, and Spain. You have, Mondragon, Emilia Romagna, about examples of governments developing these sort of online platforms of mapping their solidarity economies, but also integrating them within their own sort of state programming, and resource sharing among them, and that's cool. And Cheyenna, do you have thoughts about regions?
I just want to share that this list is not exhaustive. And so if you look on RIPESS, again, that RIPESS is a good place to go if you're interested in some of the global examples, and definitely Southeast Asia, the Philippines, a number of other places are active in this space. And there's a lot to learn from their examples, because the conditions are different than in the United States. And so you'll find that political parties, labor, and government and social movements play different roles than you might expect, and that reveals some very interesting opportunities for our organizing. Even the recent example of Greece and the way that solidarity economics is playing out in meeting very immediate needs, and the way that's played into the political developments there, I think is fascinating. So it's good to study on your global history, even if it seems like this stuff is a little far out there. And for anybody who's looking at this and you don't know who any of these groups are and it feels like a lot, maybe at the end we can try to think of some resources where you might be able to find out more about these without just doing a Google search and hoping for the best. So,
woo, thanks. So, local organizing efforts. I think here's where we're going to talk about we're going to highlight two of the programs that we do that's really on the more organizing bent, and they're related to each other. So I'm going to actually turn it over to Cheyenna to describe the Cooperative Economic Alliance of New York City, or CENIC. And then try and scroll, but that might not work.
So I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief, but basically SolidarityNYC was formed out of the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network Forum with the idea that we would promote, connect, and support the solidarity economy. So, all right, what did that mean? There was a map, there were some films, there was some popular education, things of this nature, but the end goal was always to bring the groups that we saw as solidarity economy organizations and enterprises together in some way as a body. And looking at different ways of doing that, we did do a lot of study of global groups, but also those that are in the United States, and began moving towards what's called a multi-stakeholder cooperative model, which we're still pursuing, and the formation of something called the Cooperative Economic Alliance in New York City. And actually, there's an S. It's the Cooperative Economics Alliance of New York City. But it's okay that that S didn't make it in there. So this is food co-ops and community gardens working on food justice. It's community development credit unions and cooperative loan funds. It's housing cooperatives and worker cooperatives and producer cooperatives. It's a lot of co-ops, but it's not just co-ops. It was very important to us that community-based organizations that are doing solidarity economy work be included. So in New York City, that means groups that are incubating different kinds of cooperative businesses, perhaps, but there are also groups that are doing, like for example, there's a barter network that one runs. Some of them do different kinds of time banking, anything along these lines that that we felt, was an economic activity that should be included. So this effort came out of many years of research. So in creating the map and the films, we just really networked. We got on everybody's listserv, went to everybody's meeting that had a meeting that we could go to, and just tried to meet a lot of people. And in going to all of these events and listening in the ways that we identified some leaders who we wanted to talk to in a deeper way. And so we put together our first deep listening project, which interviewed some, I want to say it was about 30 people all told from all of these different sectors, and invited them to answer questions about sort of the state of their organizations and then their hopes and dreams for collaboration. And we issued a report about that, which you can find on our website. It's called Growing a Resilient City. So that was report one. And then we gathered all those people together for a meeting and a report back, and people were seriously excited about the idea of working together. So that was in, I guess, 2012, just after Occupy. And then we got a small grant from Rockefeller Foundation to support additional research. So we did that, and we did focus groups in all these different sectors and did a whole other round. And at that point, SolidarityNYC, which is a volunteer collective of all these organizers, began integrating the leadership of these other groups. So up to that point, membership in this project had just been really just based on who was showing up. And at the point where it moved from being research to actually leadership and shaping what this was going to be, we began inviting people in. And so there was a steering committee that formed of different leaders that is still in place and is designing this new coalition. So that's a little bit about the process of it. In terms of its mission and goals, the main one is to bring these groups together to figure out how they can best support each other and meet each other's needs. So some things that have been talked about are elevating the story of solidarity economy groups and as a whole, like the potential of the cooperative economy in general, which we sometimes use solidarity economy and cooperative economy interchangeably because cooperative is more familiar to many of these groups and it's their language. And we've talked about technical assistance and education that these groups can provide to each other. We talked about political advocacy that they could be working towards, and we've also talked about financing. So what would it mean for this group to have a common loan fund? So those are just some of the things that are on the table that we are working through. And there's a second report that was done with the focus groups if you want to go and read about that. That is also on our website. And then spring of 2015, we're hoping to actually launch its own website, and there'll be a lot more information about Scenic available on the web. In the meantime, it is still housed under SolidarityNYC. So if you have questions about it, you should contact us. I think that's it, Laura, unless you have questions.
Just when does Scenic happen? That's my favorite question. I love it. I love hearing about it every time you do it. And every time we do it. So, okay, so then you want to talk a little bit about Solidarity Cities?
Yes. So Solidarity Cities, which usually has a hashtag in front of it, is the field trip experience, basically. We realized that there were a lot of other groups in other cities and regions who were, even other countries, who were doing this work, and that we didn't know very much about them, and we didn't have an opportunity to interact with them. So, we could call people up periodically, and that's great, and it's nice to use the internet and see each other's faces through Skype or something, but the reality was we wanted to actually go and see the places where this was happening, talk to people on the ground, go on tours of the different organizations that were making it up, and really understand how they were dealing with some of the harder issues that we were facing in New York. And some of those issues include how do you include marginalized communities, and how do you balance the power of grassroots groups that are in or that are weaker or in startup mode or just have less capacity with groups that are better financed, maybe have greater membership, whatever the case may be. Things of this nature. We wanted to talk shop. So we went to Philadelphia, Montreal, Ithaca, and Syracuse. There's a statewide group forming in New York State, and we wanted to be supporting that and playing a role in that. Planned to go to Worcester, basically anything that was in easy driving or train distance from New York. And this was seen as sort of a novel idea. We didn't get any funding for it. We just organized it and sent people out. We did solidarity housing, and people were very open to us. This could be a nonprofit program that's funded by somebody. Just throw that out there. Anybody wants to do that, that would be great. But just as a suggestion to other people, you know, if you want to do solidarity economy organizing, definitely reach out to people. You know, you need mentors and you need peers that are doing this work, and you really need to learn from what others are doing. So don't be shy about reaching out to these organizations and learning more. I don't know, Lauren, if you want to add anything.
The only thing I'll add about like the benefit of doing Solidarity Cities for me was like the entire process of doing it strengthened my analysis of the solidarity economy and some of the work that we're doing, and that a lot of it was about, you know, just practical organizing things that I saw that I was like, this is so easy, like, I can't believe we've never done this, sort of examples. And other things are just really great thought-provoking conversations about realizing what sort of stage our organizing is in New York City, and like what are all these different potential roads that we could take. I think that at least in Montreal, it was like, oh, this is a very particular pathway and quote-unquote end point or end goal that we could think and organize around if that's the thing we wanted to do. But it's not without its struggle, and so I think each time, like when we were in Philly or Montreal or Ithaca, we really had to think about what are the things we want to preserve and prioritize as we move forward and organize around, what are the things we want to organize around and sort of raise up. And so it makes you have that conversation over and over again, because you might have some sort of like sterling, wonderful Pollyanna vision of like what this example was like in like Montreal or in Philly, and then hearing all these different stakeholders in one weekend, it really painted for me a really great thorough picture, and then allowed me to think about what are the sort of things I want to take home to New York City, and what are the things that are applicable, and what part of their context is replicable or not, and what is so specific. And yeah, so I think that it's one of those things that seems like once we thought about it and thought about doing Solidarity Cities and then like did it, seemed like such a no-brainer. We're like, everyone should always be doing this all of the time. And I don't know how we're doing this.
Yeah, and just to note that one of the things about SolidarityNYC is we don't do anything unless there's an organizing need, you know, because this is all work and it costs money, you know, that we mostly have to put in ourselves or we have to go find it somewhere. And so it was essential that we go meet with these folks because we were facing these questions and needed to hear other people's thoughts on it. And so it was very important for that. And the last thing I'll share is that we are synthesizing all of this into a report, which I think is going to be done by spring 2015. So you'll be able to learn a little bit about what we learned, but definitely go meet your people in other cities, you know.
Okay. So one of the other projects that we worked on, which is one of our major undertakings and early projects, was our map of the solidarity economy in New York City, which lives on the front of our site. And the map started as a way to represent all of the solidarity economy activity that was happening within the city, and a way for practitioners to see each other and to see each other's work. I think a lot of the time when you're organizing within this space, and especially if it's something like new or newer that you're doing or you're new to this space, it feels like you're organizing in a silo and you don't know what the other resources and people are around you. So this is like a very simple way of saying there are other people that are doing cooperative finance work. There are people doing community like CSAs. There are people doing food co-ops, and look at all these areas that are active. And I always want to reiterate that it's also not an exhaustive sort of directory of activity, because the central problem with maps, although they're wonderful and I love them and do them a lot, is that the minute you put up that information, it's different. And there's no way, or there's no more, I don't know, there's no easier way for like a business to contact you and say that they're like not running or that these are their hours or whatever. So it was always a way for people to see each other. And that it sort of helped genesis a couple of our projects, a couple of our research projects, including the Deep Listening and Movement Building project Cheyenna mentioned when she was talking about CNIC, which was getting all these practitioners together and identifying needs and desires and wants from the movement and from each other. And that helped sort of seed what we would do with CNIC. Now we've noticed that people are coming to the map from like a broader tent than just like the quote-unquote movement space, right? So people have been using it in more of like a how can I find healthcare that's sliding scale sort of thing, like as a more directory thing. So in this next phase of our mapping project, we're looking to sort of fill in more of the context of the solidarity economy on our site, more putting in more of a public ed spin on it, like a directory of terms when we talk about what is a co-op, what does a sliding scale mean, what does a bartering thing mean, all of those sort of gaps that we went in assuming people knew because of the audience that we were talking to. And so now we're being really conscious about what that audience looks like now that it's sort of filled out and got a lot of traction. So we're very proud of this map, but it is another thing that takes a lot of work. But we're really thankful to the Data Commons, which is a co-op that we are a part of that is all about exchanging data within the solidarity economy, for helping us. And you should all join the Data Commons as well. That is my plug. So you can see with this graphic, this is a poster of the map, which is more interactive online because anyone can sort of submit a location or submit an activity or a site to the map, and then it can be updated. But our categories right now are divided as like food, services, housing, health, this wonderful learn and play section, advocacy and organizing stuff, and transportation. And that's how it's broken out. And you can see all these locations. I always love looking at it and being like, there's no activity in this like middle of Manhattan, and realizing that's Central Park. So it's pretty great. And Cheyenna, I don't know what you want to say about the map and lots of other things. I could go on.
I think the main thing to share is that like you said, the map is an organizing tool, but it's been inward facing for one community, and now it's in the middle of this switch. We get a lot of requests for support with other kinds of mapping, and the one thing that I do think I should sort of lift up for people about that is that, it gets back to that, what is the solidarity economy? And what is that definition for people, and what is the new economy, and what is the sharing economy, and all this, that, and the other. And people in other cities often ask us for technical assistance, including access to the website that we use, like our software and some of our tools. And if people who see this are interested in that, we should talk about it. We are very open to that. We do try to support. We've directly supported a group in the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, and we also directly supported a group in the Philippines. There may even be others, but those are the two that come to mind most immediately. There's one in San Francisco that's been in touch. So that is there, but there's always this question of sort of who makes the map and who doesn't. The last thing I'll say about the map is that during Occupy, right, where you had suddenly a lot of people who might not have an activist background, might not have any knowledge about solidarity economy initiatives. We were able to take this print version of the map down to Zuccotti Park, and that helped to inspire the creation of 5 new worker cooperatives in New York City, which was no small feat. And if you think about it, it's just because we had this beautiful visual that people could look at, and the poster version is, I don't know, what, 5 feet maybe tall. It's very large, and people see it and go, "Oh my God, this already exists. I could be part of this. I could be supporting this." And that gets back to like the first thing we said about how you don't have to wait for the revolution, or the apocalypse, to start doing the work now. You can plug in. And so just if you are a group that's thinking about solidarity economy work and how to move forward, the maps are a really good way to start, not just because it's a tool for organizing the community, but also for sharing this information more broadly and inspiring people to start new stuff. So that's it.
In thinking about all of the examples we've talked about and talking about how large and nice and fluctuous is not a word, but diverse, okay, this space is. When we do this 101 session with like newcomers to the movement, or like maybe students, we always leave off with this great "what can you do" slide, because it seems really overwhelming when we say like, hey, this thing is bigger than you thought it was, you just have to plug into it, and there are like several ways to do that. So thinking about our own examples, we make art. One of my favorite projects that I actually wasn't around for the genesis for was our short films, which also has a typo in that. Don't look. Our short films about the solidarity economy, and it highlighted like different people doing different work. It highlighted like great community health organization. It highlighted food co-ops. It highlighted like participatory budgeting. And we worked with the Brooklyn Filmmakers Collective and the Meerkat Media Collective, which are great organizations, great art and film organizations that are like collectively run. Especially Meerkat is one great example. So one of my like happy things about being in SolidarityNYC and being in this movement is, talking about the work of working together and like standing on my soapbox saying like that is what we need to do, but then also just getting needs met and making this work possible through cooperation. And so I think our films are a good example of that. And I am a big like art and public education sort of person, so just like jumping down, those are both great mediums to talk to reify the solidarity economy framework. It's hard to get people to like the networking and organizing thing without some sort of context or some sort of work like this. And I think that I've often experienced where like this work of doing the 101 stuff and this work of making the solidarity economy like transferable to other people, and there are a lot of politics in doing that, but in general I felt that it's been something that's sort of downplayed because we might think that the more quote-unquote legitimate work is like building these brick and mortar institutions and not building a cooperative consciousness. And I am a big advocate for the consciousness piece and a big advocate for feelings and cooperative feeling things. And the networking, I think that the networking and the organizing go hand in hand. You have to show up to other people's things. And this is going back to what I had mentioned about organizing in silos. Look, I even wrote it. Do not organize in a silo. You would be sad. And that's really what, solidarity is. It's realizing a common struggle. And so going to all these meetings, and I think it's been especially important thinking about the climate in New York City, about all of the groups really stepping up about police brutality, for example, and making the connections between this racial injustice that we've seen over and over and over again, and this economic work that we need to do, because I think obviously the two are very connected, but there's like a lot of work being done about bridging that analysis, which is absolutely crucial. So showing up is a huge part of being in this space, and not just like putting out projects, because my big fear and something that I've seen is the sort of reinventing the wheel, like people doing projects that are exactly the same as someone else's work, and often there's like a power dynamic or power differential between those two people and what gets called legitimate and what doesn't. We have to be really conscious about erasure within the movement, and knowing that you don't have to participate in the same way in each space. You don't have to be the person with the bullhorn in each meeting. But you do have to have a consciousness and realize what other people's end goal is, even if that is not exactly the same as what you're imagining, what sort of social transformation you're thinking of. Social transformation for Solidarity NYC may not be the same as social transformations for people doing more explicit like housing justice work. But we need to realize how these things are matched and how to work together. So, Cheyenna, I feel like I've spoken a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think, you've covered everything. The last thing I would put in here about educate is you're not just educating other people, you also have to educate yourself. And that's, I talked about that with the Solidarity Cities, but that really it's so crucial. And yeah, you're networking because you want people to do your thing or whatever, but really you're networking because you probably don't know anything. Odds are good that you don't know much about the different groups that you're going to encounter, and you need to find out what's happening with them and what matters to them, and really listen to them. And whether that's in a formal way or an informal way, that's the key to organizing. So, everything that Solidarity NYC has done has been based on listening, in the hopes of building towards democracy within the solidarity economy space. And I think that's the most important. That's the most important thing. That's what I would really hope people would take away.
So, in closing, this beautiful quote: "The solidarity economy does not arise from thinkers or ideas. It is the outcome of the concrete historical struggle of the human being to live and to develop as an individual and a collective." I love that quote because of the both inside outside like necessity and balance in that individual and collective thing, and realizing what are your personal individual responsibilities, and then what are your responsibilities to this community that you're a part of, whether that be in something like a great feminist democratic collective like Solidarity NYC, or in your neighborhood, or as a human. And I think that I couldn't really like live without thinking about my life that way. I'd be really sad. So thank you so much for allowing us to talk about solidarity and great radical things with you. We have a bunch of resources on our website, which is solidaritynyc.org. We have our reports that we mentioned. We also have a lot of like more 101 materials that we've pulled from different places around the internet and given credit to, obviously. That's all there. We have resources about how to do 101 workshops, and we have cute posters. And Cheyenna, is there something I'm forgetting about resources and things people should do?
No, if you want to stay updated on any of the stuff that we do a quarterly newsletter, and obviously we're on social media, although Facebook is somewhat dead to us right now, but nonetheless, due to their algorithms and their changes. But that's a way to kind of keep in touch with what we're doing. And also, just we're really open about responding to inquiries. So if anybody had any questions or wanted to share, what you were doing, or if you were thinking about getting something like this going, the collective has has shifted a lot over the 6 years that it's been in place. And there's a lot to be said about developing an organizing collective and developing a culture to support this kind of work that really embodies the values of it. And we've written a lot about that, and some of that is on the website too. So I feel like we just barely touched on some of the programs, so we didn't even really get it at the deeper work that we're doing. And yeah, that's there. That's available beyond this. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Hey,
Hey.
thank you.
You.
The end.
And